ustedes. Muchísimas gracias por la invitación. Un equipo súper impresionante, ¿cierto? Bueno, entonces, pero lo más importante de todo es para escuchar su mujer. Y mi mujer me dijo que, mira, John, es mejor si está hablando en inglés, porque es su propio idioma. Entonces, discúlpeme, pero voy a cambiar hasta inglés ahora. Pero muchísimas gracias por venir. Today, we're going to talk about water.
And we're going to talk about Chilean water and the situation here, which is actually indicative of so much of the world. You have the good fortune of having much more water than many places. So it's no time for panic, but it is a very critical time for preparation. And we look at this lake that you all well know, and we can look at it and think that this is the result of a mega drought, right? But is it really? We learned on Monday from the speaker that no, this was overexploitation. The farmers had been pulling water out excessively for many years, and only the drought pulled the cloth back to show what was really going on. And so this water can disappear. And I was very pleased to hear that Dua Lipa was in town. Do you know Dua Lipa? Anybody who've heard her songs, right? And Dua Lipa, of course, you might think that she sings songs that are about love and romance and adult themes. But no, actually it's about water. So the Houdini song, you should listen to it carefully. It's really all about this water and how it disappeared and how it might disappear if it's not treated properly. So I want to give you a brief overview of what I'm going to be talking about. And really it deals with the fact of the very specific climate that you live in. It's an episodic climate. It's a climate with wet winters and dry summers. And that means that we must carry water over between seasons. This is not true of all places, but it's very clearly true here. Furthermore, you have the great fortune of a giant range of mountains which hold vast amounts of water. So if everything should go very poorly for Chile, you have a backup that other people are very jealous of. So that's a very important point to remember. But finally, I want to talk about a positive future, a future where we can use our ideas, our minds, our capacity as humans to actually prepare ourselves for the future, and moreover, to prepare future generations. Now, let's see. Do it. Okay, so how does an aquifer work? Below our feet is water. Lots and lots of water. It's invisible. You don't see it. Under natural conditions, what happens is the aquifer fills up until there's a natural place for the water to go. And under natural conditions, the water level changes very little during the year. It empties out a little bit, but then stays stable. When people come along, and by the way, people are the one organism that depends most on groundwater. 50% of people depend on this groundwater. Very few other organisms care at all. But we care a great deal. So when we pump down an aquifer to a well, we create a space. Now, one point of that space is a disaster. Oh my gosh, the water's going away. But we will talk about the fact that actually that space offers an opportunity. And so it offers an opportunity to dynamically use the aquifers as our bank account. And we can actually refill that bank account. Now, let's, of course, as I mentioned, the backup for everything eventually is the end use. They are there. You have to understand that the literature shows very statistically that there's a tremendous amount of water there. And so there's been very good work in the last few years done here in Chile that shows this. But let's look at Casablanca. Casablanca, a lovely valley not far from here, right? And what we see in this is the dark blue line is the average precipitation. And what you'll notice is that during most years before the year 2000, you would see that the aquifer would go down in the summer when farmers were using it, but then it would recuperate and come back up. But then, when the rainfall diminished, all of a sudden reveal the exploitation of this aquifer. Is this a disaster? Well, actually, no. The productivity of Casablanca maintained because of this groundwater. But we must be very careful to manage it so that in the future we refill that aquifer. You might say, again, that we experienced this tremendous drought, and that was the source of so many of our problems. Well, it's important to look at the data carefully, and you can fairly see it. But here is a red line. This is the beginning of the drought. This part is showing how much water was being pumped out of aquifers before the drought. And you'll actually notice that the rate of pumping the increase went down after the drought, which is a bit of a surprise. So what we saw when we look at the data showing the levels of water in the aquifers is, in fact, they were dropping, the gray lines were dropping far before the drought started. So actually, like the lake, we're pulling back the covers and seeing that there was exploitation of the water, and in fact, it was critical and increasing, and we were seeing already great diminution in the water levels that were in the aquifers. Now, I'm staying at the Hotel Meridian, and the Hotel Meridian has about 20 floors. That is how far Chile has pulled down the aquifers in recent years. So, in one sense, and here is the mega drought. Okay, so they had been pulling down aquifers before the drought. Of course, during the drought, there was less rainfall, so they had to extract even more water. And so we see that this could very well end poorly for Chile. This is not like great news, right? However, we can look at it on the other side and say, well, we have a lot of room to store water now. And so we can also think of it from those two sides of the coin. Now, one of the things that's interesting is to look at a region of Chile, and the red lines are the mega drought period. And in the mega drought period, when you look at those red lines versus the blue lines, do you see something totally different? No, you see something that's actually a little different. It's about 39% different. But in fact, the driest year in Chilean history was 1998, and I happened to be in Chile in 1998, and it was a very dry year. But in fact, the mega drought is very much in keeping with the variability that we would expect in this climate. So we need to be very careful to not point to the mega drought and say that is the source of all of our problems. Of course it was very dry. Of course it was a limitation of water resources. But it is a situation for which we should be planning and preparing, not shocked or saying this is something completely out of what we would expect. So let's talk now a little bit about agriculture, soil, and how the activities that we take part in above the soil and in the soil affect where the water goes. So you know that Chile has been very successful at producing a lot of great food from its agricultural sector. It may surprise you that, in fact, the value of Chilean agriculture accelerated in the last few years. So we're seeing not only sustained productivity, but increasing productivity. The interesting thing is that is in light of the fact that the area cultivated in Chile is going down. It's going down dramatically. Well, how is that? Why is that? How can we have diminishing land cover and yet increasing productivity? Well, we'll talk about that more with respect to the growing of wheat, which I think you'll agree that dryland wheat has reduced in Chile, right? So a lot of this lost area is lost dryland wheat, which was not irrigated. And so where did we get the value? It was through intensification of our agricultural practices. So what we see here, for example, is a change in efficiency between irrigation as conducted in 1997 versus 2007. And in that period, we experienced a 35% increase in efficiency. Wow, that's great. That's part of the intensification. But there's a double-edged sword here. What happens when you become extremely efficient with water? If you're irrigating by goteo, by just drop by drop, what you have is a lot less percolation. And so in the traditional irrigation systems, they had canals that would lose water constantly. And they would typically keep those canals wet all year long. They'd keep water in them. They were replenishing the aquifers. As we put those in tubes and as we cement line those canals and make our systems more efficient, we're actually reducing the recharge of the aquifers. So we have to be very, very careful. With every positive, there can be a flip side. Kind of a Zen concept here, but it applies to water as well. Now let's look at some really cool soil. The soils of the Secano Interior. This is some work we did over the last decade, and what we're doing is applying water here outside of Ningüe,
And what we want to know is how does water go into the soil versus how does it run off? And so we simply measured that. And what we see here is 1 through 8 are pictures taken from the exact same spot after each irrigation. And what we see is the cracks in the soil. This is a highly expansive soil. The cracks close up. And then this soil is a heavy clay soil, and there is almost no further infiltration once those cracks have closed. And so, in fact, what you can see is that in the first 10 centimeters of rainfall, there was no runoff at all. And then each plot showed more and more runoff. And we see that by 30 centimeters of rain, that there was almost 100% runoff. So, if you think about the hydrology of the Rio Lonquén, for example, in the winter, what was happening to the water when they have almost a meter of rainfall, so let's say 800 millimeters, and only the first 300 millimeters could go into the soil? What happened to the rest of the water? It went to the ocean. And it carried a lot of sediments with it. And we'll take a look at a horse a little bit later and see what that has to do with this whole story. But what also happened in the last 20 years was a transformation that I had completely not expected. And so what we saw here, we have a field of wheat in front of a forest. And what has been happening is there's been a tremendous changeover from dryland wheat to forests in the Secano Interior. And so what we did is we looked for places where we could find times, places that had specific dates when they changed over. And what we wanted to figure out was what in time happens as the forest matures. Does that change the hydrology? Everyone was worried that the trees are taking up all the water. Well, is that what's going on? What happens when these trees are planted? It's a massive change that's happening here in Chile. And so here we're going to look at this data for a moment. In the yellow, we have the conditions in the summer. And on the vertical, we have how much water can go in. And what we see under traditional wheat on the left, the amount of water that goes in the summer is 10 times, if not 30 times higher than what can get in the winter. So when those cracks close, the soil cannot accept any more water. In the other hand, if we look at the industrial forest, we see a tremendous decrease in the amount of water that can go in the summer because the cracks never open up. It never gets that dry. The trees don't like it that dry. But in the winter, we see 10 times higher infiltration. So what are these trees doing? They're taking water that otherwise would have gone to the ocean, and they're setting it aside for their dry season. So we're actually getting tremendous amounts more infiltration. Now, if you look at a native forest, it's even more dramatic. In the native forest, the permeability is 100 times higher. And this was something we discovered by accident. When we were here in the winter, we were running tests. There was a nice little forest. We ran a test, and all of a sudden we saw this tremendous ability in the winter of these forest soils, the same soils, just having planted a forest. So, and if we look at transects from here to Valdivia, the same data show up. Of course, God has a sense of humor. And so what we find in the one location where we did the little study to set the whole thing forward, where we found the high permeability in the forest, of course, when we came back, that wasn't there. Everywhere else has the correct patterns. But that's just God's sense of humor, I think. Okay, so what do we see? We see that the forests have transformed the soils. Am I pro-forest or anti-forest? No. But it is remarkable, their impact on the hydrology of Chile. And I claim that it's not obvious that this is a negative thing. Let's take a look, though, at technologies that might be useful here. One of the things you'll see in the Secano Interior are riverbeds full of sand. And there's a special technology called sand dams, where we can put a dam into a river, capture the sand, and then we get all the water held in the sand itself. This means there's no evaporation, no problem with mosquitoes or other insects, and it gives a supply of water for the people locally, as well as recharging the aquifers. If we look at this in construction in Kenya, here's a typical site. Here they're putting in the dam, and this is after 1 year. Now, what we see is that the dam has successfully captured the water, but unfortunately, it also kept the silt and the clay there. And that means that instead of having clean sand, we have sand where it's all filled in with silt and clay, and the water is not going to be available. So what can we do? We go to our laboratory, and here's the last picture where it's full of sand, but we go to our laboratory and we say, now, isn't there a way that we could have the turbulence of the water always be just sufficient to carry away the clay and carry away the silt, but keep the sand? And so if you do the hydraulic analysis, indeed, it turns out the French were right all along. The Eiffel Tower shape, what it does is it adjusts this departure point, adjusts the turbulence exactly to maintain only sand behind my dam. And so I can gather pure sand rather than having it filled with silt and clay. This can be very important for water, but it's also very useful if you're doing construction. It's nice to have a source of sand where you have to invest no energy at all. The river does the work for you. Now, there's another technology I want to make sure you're aware of, which are called managed aquifer recharge. In this case, we simply put water out into excavated basins and we recharge the aquifer. And in this area, this river that we see coming in from the right was a critical habitat for fish, and the farmers used to completely take all the water. This was illegal as of year 2000. The farmers didn't have a source of water. What are we going to do? The Corps of Engineers, who are the military folks, come in and say, we know how to solve this problem. Give us $1 billion and we'll build a big dam. But we won't build it where the river is. We'll build it off on another channel and we'll pump the water 14 miles to this dam, and then you can use it in the summer. So $1 billion solution. We said, wait a minute, we're standing on the reservoir. Why don't we just take that water and infiltrate it? So we did a three-dimensional model, including all the types of plants that were grown, all the direction for all of the creeks and in the area, and we designed where we could take 11 points of infiltration and recover the aquifer. And then the farmers would have all the water they wanted immediately under their feet at almost no cost. So what we see is that the Corps of Engineers project was going to have a $1 billion cost, $200,000 per hectare, whereas our approach was $500 per hectare to build, and it costs $5 a hectare to run. So we don't have to do the most expensive solutions nor the most dramatic solutions, but there are critical solutions that we do need to follow. And we can accelerate this work. And here I show a laboratory with all these young students who are engineering students who want to solve these problems. And what we do is we put all of their solutions online. So you can, anywhere in the world now, grab these instrumentation solutions where you can make measurements that have never been made before. And this is a global process of designing, developing, and advancing instrumentation for management of water. This is a small flavor of the types of things we do in that lab. We develop soil moisture sensors, electronic DNA samplers, all nature of things. Here is an example of the old technology for measuring plants and seeing the stress of plants by their size. And we have an undergraduate student, so a 20-year-old student. She now has 2 patents and 1 peer-reviewed article, and she is changing the world by making much better measurements than ever before. So we need to be mindful of our water. We have solutions at our hands. This is not an impossible solution. However, we must invest and we must take care, and we must not ignore the fact that our future, our children's future, rests entirely on our behavior. This horse, who I mentioned earlier, was very patient. It thought that nothing would ever change, but it was wrong on all counts. I didn't talk to it personally, but I'm just guessing it was wrong on all counts. But the soil level here, they had in the last 100 years 1 meter of soil loss. That was a dramatic change to the productivity of this environment. That was using the Trigo. If you look now at that landscape, you will see no wheat. It's pure forest. Interestingly, it's very controversial, but if I have to think of one thing that Chile has done to diminish carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the planting of trees in the Secano Interior could be the greatest single contribution of this country. So I thank you for your patience and your interest, and please take care of your aquifers, and I'll see you in 20 years, and hopefully these things will all be recovered.